here to necessarily contradict that chromosome 2 fusion disproves, young Earth creationism, but I'm just curious as to, you guys obviously have studied it much more in depth than I have, so I just wanted to get your take on what that was.
Or are you a creationist or an evolutionist, Enigma?
Well, I haven't come to a firm conclusion. I tend towards theistic evolution, and I do consider myself to be a Christian, but I'm kind of side with science on old Earth and intelligent design. And I think, if God is an infinite mind, that he could have created the laws of physics and chemistry in such a way that he used it to progress to the point where we're at now through those means rather than special creation.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here once again. Thank you for the super chat. I would, so you're always welcome into these streams, of course. I would say when it comes to the chromosome 2 fusion, my position on it would be, there's 2 points I would make, and then John can jump in too. Firstly, even the evolutionists would admit that this fusion event happened. It would be indirect evidence, as they would admit that it happened in the human line. Okay, they would need some kind of bottleneck to explain why every single human today actually has this fusion. We have 46 chromosomes while the apes have 48, right? So here's the thing. How does the evolutionary story explain the fact that we all have this so-called fusion event? It would make more sense in our model because we have what's called the flood bottleneck. We also have an event at the Tower of Babel where all humans congregated, right? So this could have easily been passed on, but I'm actually under the position that it doesn't look like there's any fusion at all because there's been a lot of research done. A geneticist, Jeffrey Tompkins, he has discovered that this so-called purported fusion site, Enigma, it's actually overlapped by a functional gene, and the evidence for this is overwhelming. The so-called fusion site appears to be a functional component. Okay, so it's not actually a fusion site, it's a functional component of the DDX11L2 gene. And there's been a lot of research done on this. And the point with that is you don't get highly, highly functional genes by slamming together 2 chromosomes, right? So that would essentially be the argument. Are you familiar with the function at the site, Enigma?
I have a very cursory knowledge of it. I guess just logically to me, it would seem interesting, or the logical point to me would be why it does seem odd that the primate, less developed primate would have the 48, and then we would have the 46, and that fusion would be there. It does seem to have a logical causal connection between those two.
Yeah, that's why. Well, here's the thing. At best, so it seems to be that the evidence. Actually, just one sec. I feel like I'm hearing some background noise. It's coming from Sal. Sal, I'm just going to mute you for now, brother. Awesome. Yeah. So here's the thing. I think that even if there was a fusion, I find it to be evidence against the position of chimpanzee human ancestry for the fact that they have no way to explain the fact that we would all have this fusion event to begin with. They would need some type of bottleneck. It's not like there's some humans that have 48 chromosomes, right? We've all got 46. Apparently we all have this fusion. But here's another major thing. There's a paper that came out recently, kind of recently. It's the Ventura paper, where they discovered that there is ape-specific, it's called ape-specific satellite DNA, and it's actually not found around the so-called fusion event. So at best, you have a human-specific fusion event unrelated to chimpanzees and the other great apes. But I'm still pretty convinced that there's no fusion. There's no fusion because of the functional nature of the so-called site, Enigma. And as I pointed out, you don't gain highly important genes by slamming together 2 chromosomes. Right. So, what are your thoughts on that?
And I think something else you have to insert into this equation too is we're talking about entirely different chromosomes, and by that I mean in literal position of the overall genome. right? It's like
Right.
13 and whatever the numbers are. I forget. It's too late. My point is that with what we are now discovering with inter and intra chromosomal gene expression variables, like from folding and such, the position of it has dramatically greater importance than was recognized. And when we were only looking at things in relation to, oh, does it have the same sequence? Right now, the literal positioning of it in relation to other stuff that has nothing, at least on the surface level, has nothing to do with it, is suddenly now having extreme importance and relevance.
Right.
So the point I'm making is that in the context of, well, why did God have this stuff? It's like, well, okay, cool. Again, thinking about this from like a programming perspective. Okay, awesome. So I've got these functions over here that do X on this platform, in this system, and I've got similar functions over here in this platform that do this. Similar functions, but they're done in different contexts, and they work with all of these other functions in a different way than they do, in A versus B. And then it's like the person coming along only looking at this one folder of code and being like, oh, well, because these two folders have very similar code, therefore A must have come from B, or A and B came from a predecessor, while refusing to look at the overall context of this little subset of code in relation to the overall program. And in my opinion, this is what we're running into now. And but people in the evolutionary camp, if they concede the point that I just made, their entire worldview collapses. So why would they ever concede that if it's going to utterly annihilate what they consider one of the fundamental proofs of their position? I yield.
Well, and that's such a great time. And Enigma, if you wanted to speak on this, I just screen shared just to kind of show
Dude, you gotta hide
sources.
SFG, you gotta hide.
I gotta hide,
listen, man. We know you love your new little personification of your ego.
Hey, that's actually a portrait of the real SFT. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so let's see. So you can see now. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So Enigma, this is, I mean, everything John was saying was just a lot of beautiful points. And if you'd like to respond to, it's a great question that you asked about the fusion event. But this I find fascinating about the title of the paper is The Evolution of African Great Ape Subtelomeric Heterochromatin and the Fusion of Human to Chromosome 2. Talks about how chimpanzee and gorilla chromosomes differ from human chromosomes by the presence of large blocks of subterminal heterochromatin thought to be composed primarily of arrays of tandem satellite sequences. So this is all absent in human chromosomes when it should be there if this was actually a fusion event that is related to humans and chimps, right? So that's why I point out, so for one, it doesn't look like there is a fusion based on the data. But even if you want to give it to the evolutionists, now I just say, based on what we know about the satellite DNA, the evolutionists have to say that it was lost or corrupted somehow after the split of chimps and humans, right? Because they say the fusion happened in the human line. Chimp, human, common ancestors 6 million years ago. They split. You got the human line, the chimp line, and somewhere in the human line, they don't know exactly where this fusion event happened. When this fusion event happened, you would have had nearly identical chromosomes, nearly identical ape-specific satellite DNA. The presence of that satellite DNA would be in the chromosomes, but now it's not there. So it looks like if it was a fusion event, to make a long story short, it was specific to humans. And according to the biblical model, we can explain the spread of the fusion. Genetic drift can explain the spread a lot easier in a biblical model because we've got our bottleneck of just 8 people. So if somebody had a fusion, because fusions do happen in nature, fusions happen all the time, it would have easily been passed on, especially if it happened prior to the flood. Well, then you've got Noah's wife, their 3 sons, and their 3 wives, Noah's 3 daughters-in-law. So either way, fusion or no fusion, I don't see it as evidence for evolution. I talked a lot there. I apologize. John did as well. Enigma, the floor is yours. I want to thank you for joining us.
No, thanks for having me on. I guess what I would say is that I would agree. Probably, evolutionists would say that the fusion, occurred before the bottleneck, and so postulating flood bottleneck or another bottleneck mechanism are equally viable on that regard. And then I don't know enough about genetics to really speak on the telomere connection at the fusion point. So as a functionality of that, I guess that's what you're referring to. I don't know if that could evolve functionality after the fusion event. But again, I just think it's interesting that that 48 and then 46 seems like that wouldn't just be a coincidence. And then also maybe you could speak on a different point. Just to me, the retrovirus connection between the lesser primates and humans, to my mind, give somewhat plausible evidence that perhaps there is a connection.
Yeah, good points there. So when it comes to, here's what's funny is if there wasn't a fusion event, which the data seems to suggest, because the reputed fusion site, Enigma, where they say this is where the fusion happened, it is overlapped by a highly, highly functional gene. So now it looks like that site that's claimed to be a fusion, it's not a fusion after all. It's actually a promoter for that DDX11L2 gene. And what's funny too is the supposed leftover telomeric sites that are found there. It's highly degenerate. And now they're finding that these internal telomeric-like sequences, they're found all throughout the genome, unrelated to fusion events, and they're involved in function, including gene expression. And here's my point. Yeah, you said, maybe this function was evolved after. Well, here's the thing. What series of mutations or what series of events could evolve that type of essential functionality? Because as I was pointing out, you can't just slam together 2 chromosomes and gain a highly functional gene. When it comes to the ERVs, Brother Sal here, Brother John can speak to this as well. I'll make a couple points. We're now finding that these endogenous retroviruses and other classes of these retrotransposons as well are highly functional. I mean, and this isn't coming from Young Earth Creationist literature. So I'm screen sharing here. Here's a few papers. Far from being junk DNA, the pervasive retrotransposons that populate the genome have a powerful capacity to influence genes in chromatin. Papers here, retroviral promoters in the human genome. Another good paper here, regulatory activities of transposable elements. The ALUs as well. This is a good one. Scientists identify new beneficial function of endogenous retroviruses in immune response. So here's the thing. Here's the question that I always ask, Enigma. I say, are these really the ancient remnants of viral infections, or are they created units of DNA function? So us as intelligent design advocates, we would say, these aren't just the leftover remnants of viral infections. These aren't mistakes. Okay, these are functional DNA units put there by the creator. And that's exactly what we're finding. We're predicting function, and we're finding more and more function in these DNA elements. And the more we study viruses, the more we realize just how important they are to ecosystem regulation, body regulation. Based on genetic entropy, genetic degeneration, you can get a virus that has gone from good to bad, of course. You're going to find degeneration due to mutations. But the reason why we would share more of these ERVs with chimpanzees than we do with other life forms, well, that's because we share more in terms of morphology, physiology, genetics, anatomy with the chimpanzee. So, of course, we're going to share more ERVs with the chimp than we would with a dog. In terms of similarity, nested hierarchies, it's just kind of assumed from a common design perspective. So I know that was a mouthful. That's my position on ERVs. And John and Sal, I'll mute myself if you guys have any points to make. And Enigma, the floor would be yours after that.
I have to respond to Faithful, Honest, and True. He's asking me for a link, and then I'll join.
Sure, yeah. John, you can, Enigma, what are your thoughts on that? Are you familiar with all the numerous functional roles now found in these ERVs?
I'm not familiar with them, but I have heard, that there is functionality that is present within those. And again, I have to admit ignorance when it comes to, deeper genetic knowledge. I don't like to make arguments from authority, but, to me, the fact that Dr. Collins would, take more of a theistic evolution with his deeper understanding of these concepts, just from my vantage point, that leads credence maybe to that hypothesis.
So I'll address that.
Yeah,
so,
take the floor, John. I don't want to.
So just like the standard secular evolutionists, Francis Collins has spent his entire life on he's in his late 60s now. The last 40 years of his professional career, he's been either evolutionist or a theistic evolutionist. And I mean, his entire BioLogos organization, everything is 100% all in on theistic evolution. And I know from reading papers and different talking points that they have on their website, and from his lectures I've watched in recent memory, I'm talking about within the last 5-6 years, positions that he is still doubling down on in spite of his expertise. I know beyond doubt, because I've read papers on this different subjects, that positions he's claiming are, proof of the evolutionary process being true, are being debunked left and right. It's not that when he was building his fundamental positions, they hadn't been addressed yet, or seen, the different conclusion had been reached at the time. But now many of them are being annihilated. And just in the last decade, are things that we're now discovering. And I mean, if you operate from the perspective that, the vast majority of the genome is non-functional, therefore evolution is true, and we're now on a utter beeline for the majority of it being functional, I mean, at what point do you concede that evolution is false? Like, if you have to have all this, you can go old Earth, whatever you want, it doesn't matter. There's literally not enough time. Here's the thing that always fascinates me about the evolutionary talking points. Of like, when you actually start to look at what we're now discovering, even with your billions of years, there hasn't been enough time. How do you explain it? If even with your deep time, there's not enough time to account for all of this, how is it remotely plausible and rational to reach the conclusions that somehow these incredibly exquisite, intricate, interdependent, spatiotemporal logic gate controls that are required for life to exist, and then you get into the three-dimensional structures that are the structural biology aspects and the quantum control components and everything, all these other things that we're discovering now, and you're reaching beyond what we have ever. The most creative sci-fi authors have never come close to imagining the things that we are discovering in biological systems. And then we're being told that, oh, it just happened through natural selection. Like, to me, it's almost like we're talking with children now. And in the context of what is trying to be explained to happen, like, no, it was Santa Claus. I know he's too fat to fit down the chimney, but it happens. Like that, I feel like that's what's being presented now with evolutionary theory. And it's not that, I know for myself personally, I am not arguing at all that adaptation cannot occur. I think that it can, 100%. It's happening through machine learning algorithms and pre-existing functional capacity that already was in play, or the ability to be modified on the fly through input-output variables is what's happening. Like, we're observing this. This is not me making this up. This isn't just supposition. Like, we're observing this happening in real time. And then we're still being told, in terms of explanations for our very existence, that somehow that's not what's happening, or wasn't what was required in order for us to exist. And to me, just, if you go beyond the surface level and the standard talking points, your mind will be absolutely blown. And I mean, not everybody necessarily, but I think most people, if you go at it with an open mind, you'll be like, hang on, I'm being told what? This makes no sense. I yield.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of the genetic code and its, the semantics and time-based variables and the almost impossibility of that just self-forming, even with their RNA world hypothesis, etc. I don't think, definitely, we're not going to see abiogenesis progress very much in our lifetimes, I don't think. So I agree with you with your logic in terms of that, and I appreciate that you demonstrate that to a lot of the non-theists.
And anyway, quick insertion.
Me,
quick insertion, because I think you and the I Know Better guy in chat are thinking that what I just said only applies to abiogenesis. That is not even remotely what I'm suggesting. I am suggesting, obviously, yes, it applies to abiogenesis. I was saying the same thing applies to evolution. Like when we get into the mind-bending control requirements that are required for like body plan variation and just gene expression in general. I mean, the stuff that has to be going on in order, like in between organism types. Like if you think, I mean, the stuff that's required for abiogenesis is insane. The exact same level of incredible, like what is acquired between different types of organisms, just between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. I mean, it's the same type of stunning differences, and you're having to explain a whole new set of functional requirements that are paradoxical and defy explanation from any kind of rational perspective. And then we hear things, and I guess I'm not trying to say this as an insult to you, but I hear this from like the evolutionists all the time. Like, no, you're talking about abiogenesis. It's like, no, this applies all the way up the food chain. It's just that what you're arguing up the food chain isn't even remotely plausible because abiogenesis isn't plausible. So therefore, of course, if it's up the food chain, it also is not plausible. It's fruit of a poison tree. But I'm saying it doesn't matter where you start in the sequence and say, oh, this came next, you still run into the exact same types of barriers. And enough of my tangent. Sorry for interruption there. I'm going to put myself on mute now. Go ahead. Floor is yours.
Yeah, I would agree with most of what you said. And, when I was in college, I started, listening to Henry Morris and CRI information, and actually went on to the school newspaper debating one of the evolutionary biologists. And of course, with whatever evidence I presented, his final statement was, anyone that believes this should not be granted a university degree. So there's definitely some crazy bias going on in their perspective. For me, just the evolution of flight always was problematic just from a logical basis, and they don't have any good theories on how that would happen through natural selection. Their speculation on reptiles, running up trees and gliding, and somehow that formed feathers and wings. I think it's kind of ridiculous. And from what I've been able to research, they don't have any really good ideas on that. It's interesting, the theory of convergent evolution and how so many different creatures have evolved flight seems that would be, like you said, even with billions of years, problematic for that to occur. I guess, part of it is just the mystery of the nature of the Godhead being able to do it. I guess, the more you delve into science and you try to use your human mind to understand the deepest mysteries of our existence, you get pulled into that fact-based paradigm that you want in your human mind to be able to understand how everything happened, and you want to think that there's a possibility that we can understand it. And we want, logically, because we don't see, matter not acting a lot in accord with the laws of physics, that, special creation or things of that nature, seem somewhat impossible just from our human perspective. And I guess, unfortunately for me, perhaps it's just a lack of faith in, what an infinite God could do. But let me get you guys' perspective on something a little bit different, and I think it's very relevant. And I think for the non-believers, their most cogent dismissal of God would be the hiddenness of God. And just on a philosophic basis, I'm curious as to how you guys would respond to that.
I'm actually planning to record a show on that. By the way, it's very good meeting you, Enigma Conjecture. I don't know that we've met before. I wanted to weigh in a little bit on the ERVs. I was just furiously typing, sending out letters for my show tomorrow on essential cell biology on my channel. So I've just launched the channel. We're up to 63 subscribers, and we're growing. So I'm finally trying to kick it into high gear to start promoting. With respect to the ERVs, I actually do see what they call nested hierarchies. Things look superficially like they evolved by a process of common descent and random mutation. And I say superficially. I'm a young cosmos creationist. I used to be an evolutionist, then became an old Earth creationist, then an old Earth person, but believed in young life. Eventually, I became a young Earth creationist, and then now a young cosmos creationist. A number of things contributed to that. But if Noah's flood is true and the fossil record is young, and if things like the faint young sun paradox are a barrier to formation of the fossil record, then that's the best, in my opinion, that really is the best argument against common descent. And if that's the case, then why would God make things look somewhat evolved? What I would respond to that, because I work professionally for a famous geneticist. He's actually the author of Genetic Entropy. I had the privilege of being his research assistant for the last 6.5 years, and he's invested a lot of his personal money to help me along, which is pretty much equivalent to a scholarship. And so this year I've been I've been transitioning to trying to do outreach, because a lot of our work was only to PhD biologists and faculty chair. And so like only 30 people on the planet for some of our publications have known what my work was about. And so specifically with regard to this nested hierarchy pattern, I've argued that just like superficially it looks like the stars and the sun orbit the earth, that's actually an optical illusion. That's not God being deceptive, because he's given us a means to reconstruct and show that the solar system is actually heliocentric. And then if we put a pencil in water, we have the Snell's law, the pencil looks bent. That's an optical illusion. It doesn't mean God's being deceptive. When we have an alternative explanation, it starts to make sense why the pencil looks bent. With respect to this nested hierarchy, I've come to the conclusion, and there's more and more evidence for this, that it's part of God's optimization of design to help us understand human biology. It is actually very fabulous. We can study kind of these more quote unquote primitive organisms like bacteria and then yeast, and then go to other mammals and kind of climb a ladder of complexity to help us understand our own biology. And there's some very deep mathematical aspects that if we do cross-sequence comparisons, we can actually start to reconstruct protein folds. There's no reason that should be there, but that's consistent with the nested hierarchy that's optimized for scientific discovery. That's like a hidden code. And so what the evolutionary biologists have misinterpreted as common descent, and somewhat understandably so, is actually a code that it's not completely hidden, because otherwise we wouldn't decipher it. It's a code optimized to help us do biology. And so I'm actually doing some work professionally on those aspects. Specifically